For thousands of years, the rocky shores of Lake Superior have concealed a story that challenges one of the oldest assumptions about North American history. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, long before iron tools or colonial maps reached the Great Lakes, people were already extracting immense quantities of pure native copper from this rugged landscape. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of ancient mining pits, massive stone hammers, and copper artifacts that travelled astonishing distances across the continent, revealing an exchange network that connected communities separated by hundreds, even thousands of miles. Yet another piece of this story survived outside the ground itself. Among the Ojibwe, whose ancestors came to live around Lake Superior centuries before sustained European contact. Knowledge of the land, its copper-bearing cliffs, and the significance of this remarkable metal was preserved through generations of lived experience and oral tradition. Their knowledge does not claim that they built every ancient mine, nor does archaeology support such a conclusion. Instead, it points to something equally compelling. A people who inherited one of North America's oldest industrial landscapes and understood its importance long before outsiders began trying to explain it. So what did the Ojibwe know about the ancient copper country? How does that knowledge compare with the archaeological record? And what does the evidence reveal about a continent whose history was far more connected than Europeans ever imagined? To understand one of North America's oldest trade networks, we have to begin with a landscape unlike almost any other on Earth. Along the southern shore of Lake Superior, where dense forests meet cold, restless water, the bedrock tells a story that began more than 1 billion years ago. Violent volcanic activity, shifting continents, and unimaginable geological forces created one of the richest deposits of native copper ever known. Unlike most parts of the world, where copper is locked inside ore and must be extracted through smelting, the copper of the Lake Superior region often emerged from the ground in nearly pure metallic form. It appeared as veins running through fractured rock, as rounded masses exposed by erosion, and sometimes as large boulders resting near the surface. For people equipped with stone hammers rather than metal tools, this was an extraordinary gift of nature. They did not need furnaces or advanced metallurgy to begin working the metal. The earth itself had already completed much of the process. Every winter, freezing water expanded inside cracks in the bedrock, loosening fresh pieces of copper every spring. Melting snow and rain washed away soil that had covered new deposits along riverbanks, shorelines, and exposed ridges. Bright reddish metal occasionally appeared against dark volcanic stone, waiting to be discovered by anyone who knew where to look. Today, the Keweenaw Peninsula in present-day Michigan is recognized as the heart of this remarkable copper country, while nearby Isle Royale preserves evidence of ancient mining scattered across its rugged interior. Modern geological surveys have confirmed what generations of indigenous communities already understood through experience. This region contains one of the world's largest concentrations of native copper. But thousands of years ago, no maps identified these deposits, and no written records described them. Knowledge of the landscape depended entirely on observation, memory, and the careful transmission of practical experience from one generation to the next. In a world where survival depended on reading the land, recognizing the unusual color of exposed rock or the gleam of metal beneath shallow soil could become knowledge of immense value. The people who first encountered this copper were not searching for wealth in the modern sense. They lived as highly adaptable hunter-gatherers, moving through forests, rivers, wetlands, and shorelines according to seasonal cycles. They understood where fish gathered during spawning seasons, where caribou and later deer migrated, where wild rice flourished, and where stones suitable for making tools could be found. Copper gradually became another resource within this deep environmental knowledge. At first, a naturally shaped piece of metal may simply have been admired for its color and unusual weight. Unlike stone, it did not shatter when struck. Instead, careful hammering gradually flattened and reshaped it into useful forms. Over time, people learned that repeated hammering hardened the metal, while gentle heating, followed by additional hammering, restored its flexibility. Without developing true smelting technology, they mastered techniques that allowed native copper to become knives, fishhooks, awls, spear points, woodworking tools, ornaments and ceremonial objects. The landscape itself encouraged experimentation. Massive glaciers that had once covered the Great Lakes region retreated only thousands of years earlier, leaving behind exposed bedrock, fresh shorelines, and countless opportunities to encounter raw copper. Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, became more than a body of water. It functioned as a natural highway connecting distant communities. Rivers flowing into the lake extended these travel routes deep into the interior, creating a network through which people, ideas, and materials could move over remarkable distances. Long before roads or permanent cities appeared, water linked communities across an immense territory, making exchange not only possible but increasingly common. To modern visitors, the forest surrounding Lake Superior can appear remote and untouched. Yet beneath the trees lies evidence of thousands of years of human activity. Ancient trails once crossed these ridges. Campsites overlooked sheltered bays. Shorelines served as landing places for birch-bark canoes. Every feature of the landscape carried meaning for those who depended on it. Copper was never isolated from this broader environment. It existed alongside fishing grounds, hunting territories, maple groves, medicinal plants, and sacred places. Understanding the metal required understanding the land itself. Centuries later, when European explorers reached the Great Lakes, many struggled to appreciate just how deeply indigenous knowledge was rooted in this environment. Some recorded stories of copper deposits, but assumed they had discovered something new. Others noticed unusual pits in the ground, without realizing they were looking at the remains of mining operations that were already thousands of years old. The true antiquity of the region's copper industry would only become clear through modern archaeology. Yet even archaeology begins with the landscape, because every artifact, every abandoned mine, and every stone hammer points back to the extraordinary geology that made this place unlike anywhere else in North America. But while the land offered copper in remarkable abundance, geology alone cannot explain what happened next. A valuable resource means little unless people recognize its potential, develop the skills to work it, and pass that knowledge across generations. The story of Lake Superior's copper country is therefore not only about rocks beneath the earth, but about the people who transformed a natural gift into one of the oldest and most influential industries in ancient North America. To understand how that transformation began, we must travel back thousands of years to the first communities that learned to shape this remarkable metal with nothing more than stone, fire, patience, and extraordinary ingenuity. Long before the Ojibwe established themselves around Lake Superior, another chapter of human ingenuity was already unfolding across the region. Archaeologists refer to these early communities collectively as the Old Copper Complex, not because they belonged to a single civilization or shared a unified culture, but because they developed an extraordinary tradition of working native copper thousands of years before metalworking emerged in many other parts of North America. Beginning around 4000 BCE and continuing for several millennia, these hunter-gatherer societies transformed naturally occurring copper into practical tools with a level of skill that still impresses researchers today. They left behind no written language, no monumental architecture, and no cities carved from stone. Instead, their legacy survives in thousands of carefully shaped copper artifacts and the ancient mining pits scattered across the forests and rocky ridges of the Lake Superior Basin. These remains reveal not an isolated discovery, but a technological tradition refined over countless generations. For much of the 19th century, scholars struggled to understand who had created these mines. Some early writers, influenced by outdated beliefs that indigenous peoples were incapable of large-scale engineering, imagined that a mysterious lost civilization or even visitors from distant continents had excavated them. Such theories reflected more about the prejudices of their own time than about the archaeological evidence. As scientific excavations expanded during the 20th century, those myths gradually disappeared. Stone hammers abandoned inside ancient pits, wooden mining tools preserved beneath layers of sediment, and radiocarbon dating of associated organic materials all pointed to a clear conclusion. The mines had been created by the ancestors of Native American communities living in the Great Lakes region during the Archaic period. There was no missing civilization waiting to be rediscovered. The remarkable achievement belonged to the indigenous peoples of North America themselves. Unlike miners in later civilizations, these early copper workers possessed no iron picks, steel chisels, or explosives. Their most important tools were rounded hammerstones, often weighing several kilograms, selected from riverbeds because of their durability. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these battered stones around ancient mining sites, many bearing unmistakable signs of repeated use. Workers likely began by identifying exposed veins of native copper running through fractured volcanic rock. They then struck the surrounding stone again and again, gradually widening natural cracks until pieces of copper could be separated from the bedrock. Fire may also have played a role in some locations. Heating rock before rapidly cooling it with water could cause fractures that made extraction easier, although the extent of this technique remains a subject of ongoing research. Every kilogram of copper represented hours or even days of demanding physical labor carried out with little more than stone, wood, and determination. Once extracted, the copper required another set of skills. Unlike brittle stone, native copper could be reshaped through repeated hammering. Craftspeople discovered that striking the metal slowly flattened it into thin sheets or elongated bars, while simultaneously hardening its structure. If the copper became too brittle, careful heating, followed by further hammering, restored its workability, a process modern metallurgists call annealing. Although these communities never developed true smelting technology, they mastered an impressive understanding of how native copper responded to heat and force. Over generations, they produced an astonishing variety of objects, including spear points, projectile tips, fish hooks, awls, knives, chisels, woodworking tools, needles, ornaments, bracelets, and decorative pendants. Many of these objects display careful workmanship that reflects not only practical knowledge but also artistic skill. Yet copper never completely replaced stone. Archaeological sites throughout the Great Lakes reveal that stone tools continued to dominate everyday life, even while copper objects became increasingly common. This was not because copper lacked value. In many cases, high-quality stone remained sharper for cutting tasks and was often easier to replace. Copper offered different advantages. It could be repaired instead of discarded, reshaped into new forms, and fashioned into tools that resisted shattering during heavy use. Rather than signaling the beginning of a so-called copper age, similar to those seen elsewhere in the world, the old copper complex represents a unique adaptation in which metal and stone technologies existed side by side for centuries. This combination reflected practical choices shaped by local environments rather than a simple march toward technological progress. Excavations have revealed that ancient mining activity extended across a surprisingly large area. On the Keweenaw Peninsula alone, researchers have documented thousands of prehistoric mining pits, ranging from shallow surface excavations to deeper shafts following rich copper veins underground. Similar evidence has been recorded on Isle Royal, where ancient miners extracted copper from exposed deposits scattered across the island's rugged terrain. Some pits were relatively small, while others measured several meters across, indicating repeated use over long periods. In many cases, abandoned stone hammers still rested exactly where workers left them thousands of years ago, preserved beneath soil and forest vegetation until archaeologists uncovered them centuries later. These discoveries provide a rare and intimate connection to individuals whose names are forever lost, but whose labor remains visible in the landscape itself. As impressive as the mining operations were, they represented only the beginning of a much larger story. Copper was not extracted simply to remain beside the mines. Finished tools and raw metal gradually moved beyond the shores of Lake Superior, passing from community to community through exchange networks that stretched far across ancient North America. Every artifact discovered hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from its geological source raises the same question. Who carried these objects across forests, rivers, and plains? What relationships connected distant communities separated by vast landscapes? The answers would reveal that the people who first worked Lake Superior's native copper were participating in a continent-wide web of interaction long before Europeans imagined such connections existed. By the time the Ojibwe people became established around Lake Superior, the great era of prehistoric copper mining had already passed into deep history. Archaeological evidence indicates that the most intensive phases of mining associated with the old copper complex had ended thousands of years earlier. This is an important distinction because modern scholarship does not support the idea that the Ojibwe themselves created the ancient mining pits found on the Keweenaw Peninsula or Isle Royale. Instead, the Ojibwe inherited a landscape that already bore the marks of countless generations of earlier inhabitants. The forests, cliffs and shorelines they came to know were not untouched wilderness, but places where people had lived, travelled, gathered resources, and shaped the environment for millennia. Understanding this continuity is essential, rather than replacing one civilization with another. The history of the Great Lakes reflects a long sequence of indigenous communities whose stories overlap, adapt, and evolve across thousands of years. According to Anishinaabe oral tradition, the ancestors of the Ojibwe, together with the Odawa and Potawatomi, undertook a gradual westward migration from the Atlantic coast. This migration, remembered through stories passed from one generation to the next, was guided by spiritual teachings that instructed them to travel until they reached the place where food grows on water, widely understood as the wild rice lakes of the western Great Lakes region. Historians and archaeologists recognize that oral traditions and archaeological evidence represent different forms of knowledge, each with its own strengths and limitations. While oral histories are not chronological records in the modern sense, they preserve cultural memory, geography, and relationships with remarkable resilience. Together with linguistic studies and archaeological research, they help explain how the Ojibwe became firmly established around Lake Superior by the time Europeans entered the region during the 17th century. For the Ojibwe, Lake Superior was far more than a geographical landmark. Known as Gichigami, the Great Sea, it stood at the center of a vast cultural landscape connected by rivers, forests, islands, and seasonal travel routes. Birchbark canoes moved efficiently across its waters, linking communities separated by hundreds of miles. Families traveled according to seasonal cycles, harvesting fish during spawning runs, gathering maple sap in spring, collecting berries in summer, hunting in autumn, and harvesting wild rice where conditions allowed. Every journey deepened familiarity with the land. Rocky outcrops, sheltered bays, river mouths, and prominent cliffs became places known not through maps, but through generations of lived experience. Within this environment, native copper remained one among many natural resources that people understood through careful observation. Unlike European explorers, who often interpreted landscapes primarily in terms of commercial potential, the Ojibwe viewed the land through relationships of responsibility and reciprocity. Resources were valuable not simply because they could be extracted, but because they existed within a living world that demanded respect. Copper, like stone, wood, water, and medicinal plants, held practical importance, while also occupying a place within broader cultural traditions. Ethnographic records from later centuries describe the use of copper in ornaments, tools, and ceremonial objects, while oral traditions preserve knowledge of places where native copper could be found naturally. None of this suggests that memories of the old copper complex survived as detailed historical accounts spanning thousands of years. Rather, it illustrates something equally significant. The people who lived around Lake Superior possessed intimate knowledge of a landscape where copper had always been present. And that knowledge remained part of everyday life long before European surveyors began documenting the region. When French missionaries, fur traders, and explorers entered the Great Lakes during the 17th century, they frequently relied on indigenous guides to navigate unfamiliar territory. Their journals contain references to copper deposits and stories shared by native communities about locations where the metal could be collected. To European observers, these accounts often seemed curious or unexpected, yet for the people who lived there, they reflected generations of accumulated environmental knowledge. Copper outcrops were not hidden secrets waiting to be discovered by outsiders. They were recognizable features within a landscape already well understood by those who depended upon it. This contrast reveals one of the recurring themes in North American history. European written records often describe as new what indigenous communities had known for centuries. The Ojibwe also occupied a strategic position within the expanding networks of exchange that characterized the Great Lakes after the end of the prehistoric mining era. Through relationships with neighboring Anishinaabe nations and other indigenous peoples, goods, information, and cultural traditions moved across enormous distances. Copper continued to circulate, although its role had changed over time. By the period of sustained European contact, trade increasingly centered on items such as furs, food, stone, shell, and eventually European manufactured goods. Yet the knowledge of where copper occurred naturally remained embedded within the landscape itself, preserved not in libraries or official documents, but in the experience of communities whose lives were inseparable from the forests and waters of Gichigami. This perspective challenges an older habit of dividing history into separate chapters before and after European arrival. The Ojibwe did not step into an empty land waiting to be interpreted, nor did they preserve every detail of events that had occurred thousands of years before. Instead, they became part of a long continuum of indigenous history in which landscapes carried memories. Resources retained cultural significance and practical knowledge passed from generation to generation. Archaeology can reveal when ancient mines were dug and where copper traveled, but it cannot fully explain how later communities understood the places they inherited. To answer that question, researchers increasingly recognize the value of listening not only to artifacts buried beneath the ground, but also to the living traditions that continued above it. That intersection between archaeological evidence and indigenous knowledge opens the door to a deeper understanding of the ancient copper country and to the remarkable trade networks that once carried its metal across an entire continent. If the ancient mines reveal how copper was taken from the earth, they tell us far less about how later generations understood the land that contained them. This is where the knowledge of the Ojibwe becomes especially important, not because it fills every gap left by archaeology, but because it preserves a different way of remembering a landscape. For centuries before European explorers arrived in the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe developed an intimate understanding of Lake Superior's shores, islands, rivers, and rocky highlands through daily life rather than written maps. Their knowledge was accumulated by traveling, hunting, fishing, gathering medicines, harvesting wild rice, and observing seasonal changes that repeated year after year. Within this vast environmental knowledge, native copper occupied a familiar place. It was not an object waiting to be discovered, but one of many natural materials that the land itself offered to those who knew where and how to look. The Ojibwe call Lake Superior Gichigami, often translated as the Great Sea. It is a fitting name for a body of water so immense that early European visitors compared it to an inland ocean. The lake shaped every aspect of life. Canoe routes connected distant communities. Rivers served as natural highways into the interior, and rocky shorelines provided landmarks recognized across generations. Knowledge of the landscape was essential for survival. Families learned where fish gathered during spawning seasons, where moose and deer could be found at different times of the year, where medicinal plants flourished, and where exposed stone revealed useful materials. Native copper belonged to this wider understanding of place. It was one resource among many, but one that carried unusual practical and cultural significance because of its unique physical properties and its striking appearance. Unlike copper ore buried deep beneath the ground, native copper often revealed itself naturally. Storms could expose fresh pieces along the shoreline. Frost and erosion gradually uncovered metallic veins in fractured bedrock. Rivers occasionally carried smaller fragments downstream, depositing them among gravel bars or shallow banks. For people who spent their lives moving through these environments, such discoveries were not extraordinary accidents, but part of an ongoing relationship with the land. Experience taught where copper was most likely to appear, which outcrops were worth revisiting, and how changing weather could expose new material. This knowledge was preserved not through written manuals, but through observation, instruction, and repeated journeys made by successive generations. European accounts from the 17th century provide an indirect glimpse into this expertise. French missionaries, traders, and explorers repeatedly relied on indigenous guides when traveling through the unfamiliar waterways of the Great Lakes. Several recorded hearing about copper-bearing locations from native communities long before European geological surveys existed. To outsiders, these reports seemed remarkable because they pointed toward valuable mineral resources in an unknown landscape. To the Ojibwe and their neighbors, however, such places were already part of a well-established geographical understanding. European observers sometimes wrote as though they had discovered the copper country themselves, yet their own journals often reveal that the information originated with the indigenous people who knew the region best. Copper also held meanings that extended beyond its practical uses. Ethnographic studies and historical accounts indicate that among the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, copper could be fashioned into ornaments, personal items, and ceremonial objects. Its warm reddish color, resistance to decay, and rarity compared with wood or stone gave it a distinctive presence. While practical tools remained important, certain copper objects also acquired symbolic value within cultural and spiritual traditions. Researchers urge caution when interpreting these practices because beliefs evolved over time and varied among communities. It would be inaccurate to assume that every use of copper remained unchanged across centuries, or that modern traditions can be projected directly into the distant past. Even so, the historical record consistently demonstrates that copper was appreciated for more than its utility alone. This distinction highlights an important difference between archaeology and oral tradition. Archaeology can determine the approximate age of mining pits, identify manufacturing techniques, and trace the movement of copper artifacts across North America. Oral tradition, on the other hand, preserves relationships between people and place, explaining why certain landscapes mattered and how knowledge of them endured across generations. One does not replace the other. Instead, they illuminate different dimensions of the past. Archaeologists cannot excavate memory, just as oral tradition is not intended to function as a chronological excavation report. When considered together, however, these forms of knowledge produce a richer understanding than either could provide alone. Modern researchers increasingly recognize the importance of collaborating with indigenous communities when studying ancient landscapes. This shift reflects more than changing academic practices. It acknowledges that many archaeological sites exist within territories where native nations have maintained cultural connections for centuries. Indigenous knowledge can help identify traditional place names, explain long-standing travel routes, and provide historical context that may not survive in written records. At the same time, scholars remain careful not to attribute every prehistoric feature to later communities without supporting evidence. Respecting indigenous knowledge means taking it seriously while also recognizing the distinct kinds of questions that archaeology and oral tradition are each able to answer. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ojibwe knowledge is not that it preserves a detailed account of prehistoric mining thousands of years ago, because current scholarship does not support such a claim. Rather, it demonstrates the extraordinary continuity of human relationships with the Lake Superior landscape. Generations came and went, technologies changed, trade networks expanded and contracted. European empires eventually arrived. Yet the cliffs, rivers, islands, and copper-bearing rocks remained familiar to the people who called Gichigami home. Their understanding of this land did not emerge from brief exploration, but from centuries of lived experience, reminding us that knowledge is not always written in books or carved into monuments. Sometimes it is carried through stories, seasonal journeys, careful observation, and the enduring relationship between a community and the place where it lives. And as archaeologists continued tracing ancient copper artifacts far beyond the shores of Lake Superior, another realization became impossible to ignore. The greatest mystery was no longer how people found the copper, but how that copper traveled across nearly an entire continent, long before the first Europeans ever set foot in North America. The true significance of Lake Superior's native copper becomes clear only when we follow the metal beyond the mines themselves. An isolated mining operation, no matter how impressive, tells only part of the story. What transformed the copper country into one of the most remarkable landscapes in ancient North America was the extraordinary distance its metal traveled. Archaeologists have recovered copper artifacts made from Great Lakes native copper hundreds and sometimes more than 1,000 miles from their geological source. These discoveries reveal that long before roads, written maps, or European ships connected the continent, indigenous communities had already built vast networks of exchange that linked forests, rivers, plains, and coastlines across much of eastern North America. The movement of copper was never simply about transporting a valuable material. It reflected relationships between people, communities, and cultures that stretched across an enormous landscape. Unlike modern trade, these exchange networks were not controlled by a single government, empire, or commercial company. There is no evidence of a centralized authority directing the movement of copper from Lake Superior to distant regions. Instead, archaeologists believe that copper passed through a series of interconnected communities, changing hands many times along established social and economic relationships. A piece of native copper, extracted near the shores of Lake Superior, may have traveled first to neighboring groups, then onward through successive exchanges until it eventually reached communities hundreds of miles away. Every transaction represented more than commerce. Trade strengthened alliances, reinforced kinship ties, facilitated diplomacy, and allowed ideas as well as materials to circulate across the continent. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for these networks comes from the wide geographic distribution of copper artifacts. Objects made from Great Lakes copper have been discovered throughout the upper Midwest, the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Plains, and parts of the southeastern United States. Archaeologists have identified awls, spear points, knives, ornaments, fishhooks, beads, bracelets, and ceremonial objects fashioned from native copper in places far removed from the Lake Superior basin. While not every copper artifact can be traced to a specific mine, advances in geochemical analysis have allowed researchers to compare trace elements within ancient objects to known copper sources. These studies suggest that at least some artifacts found across distant regions originated from the unique native copper deposits of the Great Lakes, confirming that the metal itself was moving through extensive indigenous exchange networks over many centuries. The rivers of eastern North America formed the backbone of this interconnected world. Long before highways crossed the continent, waterways provided efficient routes for travel and communication. Canoes could navigate countless lakes, rivers, and portages, linking the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system, the Ohio Valley, and beyond. A traveler leaving Lake Superior could gradually move south through interconnected waterways, carrying goods from one community to another without ever needing a permanent road. These natural transportation corridors made long-distance exchange not only possible but practical. Generations of indigenous travelers knew where rivers connected, where portages shortened difficult journeys, and where seasonal camps offered opportunities to meet neighboring groups. Geography itself encouraged interaction, and copper became one of many valuable materials circulating through these established routes. Yet copper was rarely the only item being exchanged. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of remarkably diverse trade networks in which communities shared a wide range of resources depending on regional environments. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast travelled inland. Obsidian from distant volcanic regions moved eastward. Chert, suitable for making stone tools, crossed hundreds of miles. Mica from the Appalachian Mountains appeared in ceremonial contexts far beyond its source. Exotic pigments, carefully crafted pottery, carved stone pipes, animal hides, and finely woven textiles all circulated through overlapping systems of exchange. Copper, therefore, occupied one place within a much larger web of relationships that connected societies possessing different environments, traditions, and specialized resources. Rather than existing in isolation, ancient North America functioned as a mosaic of interconnected communities linked by both material exchange and shared social practices. This realization has transformed how archaeologists understand pre-Columbian North America. For generations, popular history often portrayed indigenous societies as small, isolated bands living largely independent of one another until Europeans introduced large-scale commerce. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have steadily dismantled that misconception. Long-distance exchange existed for thousands of years before Columbus reached the Caribbean. Communities maintained relationships across remarkable distances, adapting to changing climates, landscapes, and cultural traditions while continuing to exchange valuable goods. Copper from Lake Superior provides one of the clearest examples because its geological origin is so distinctive. Every artifact traced back to the Great Lakes serves as tangible evidence that ideas, technologies, and materials moved through networks far older than European exploration. Not every piece of copper necessarily represented economic value alone. Many archaeologists believe certain objects carried symbolic or ceremonial importance alongside their practical uses. Carefully crafted ornaments found in burial contexts suggest that copper could communicate identity, status, or spiritual significance depending on cultural traditions. Because beliefs varied among different societies and changed over time, researchers avoid broad generalizations. Nevertheless, the repeated appearance of finely worked copper in ceremonial settings indicates that the metal often possessed meanings extending beyond simple utility. Its bright reddish color, durability, and rarity in many regions likely contributed to its special status. As copper traveled farther from its geological source, its scarcity may have increased both its material and symbolic value. For the Ojibwe, who later lived around Lake Superior, these ancient exchange networks formed part of the inherited landscape, even if the most intensive period of prehistoric mining had already ended. They occupied the homeland from which much of the continent's native copper had once originated. Their knowledge of the land, waterways, and natural copper deposits connected them to a place whose influence had reached far beyond the horizon for thousands of years. Although the trade systems evolved over time, and new goods eventually entered indigenous economies after European contact, the memory of Lake Superior as a place of exceptional natural abundance endured. The copper country remained more than a geological curiosity. It stood at the center of one of North America's oldest stories of human connection. But every thriving network eventually changes. By the time Europeans began recording the Great Lakes in written documents during the 17th century, the continent's exchange systems had already undergone countless transformations. Ancient copper was still known, yet the massive mining operations of the distant past had long since ceased. What caused such an extensive industry to decline remains one of archaeology's most intriguing questions, and answering it requires looking beyond the artifacts themselves to the changing societies that once gave them meaning. When European explorers finally reached the Great Lakes during the 17th century, they entered a world that had already been shaped by thousands of years of indigenous history. Yet most of them failed to recognize just how ancient that history truly was. French missionaries, fur traders, and explorers encountered native communities with extensive knowledge of the region's rivers, forests, and mineral resources. But they often interpreted what they saw through familiar European assumptions. To many newcomers, North America appeared to be a vast frontier waiting to be explored, rather than a homeland whose landscapes had been understood for countless generations. This misunderstanding would shape the earliest written accounts of Lake Superior's copper country, and for a time obscure the remarkable antiquity of the ancient mines. Among the first Europeans to describe the region were French missionaries who travelled alongside indigenous guides. Their journals occasionally mentioned stories of unusually large copper deposits near Lake Superior, and recorded reports of exposed masses of native copper along the shoreline. These observations attracted attention because copper was already a valuable commodity in Europe, where mining required expensive labor and complex smelting technology. The idea that enormous pieces of nearly pure metal could simply emerge from the ground seemed almost unbelievable. Yet the explorers themselves rarely located these places without indigenous assistance. Native guides knew the waterways, the portages, and the landscapes where copper naturally appeared. European knowledge of the region was from the very beginning built upon indigenous geographical knowledge, even if that dependence was not always fully acknowledged. As reports about the copper country spread across Europe, curiosity grew. Governments, merchants, and investors saw the possibility of future mineral wealth, while scholars struggled to explain the strange mining pits occasionally encountered in the forests. Some observers assumed they were relatively recent excavations made by indigenous communities living at the time. Others proposed far more imaginative explanations. During the 19th century, before archaeology developed into a modern scientific discipline, speculative theories flourished. Writers suggested that the mines had been created by Phoenicians, Egyptians, Vikings, or members of some mysterious lost civilization that had supposedly disappeared before the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans arrived. These ideas reflected popular fascination with ancient mysteries, but they also revealed a persistent unwillingness to recognize the engineering abilities of indigenous peoples. Rather than accepting that native communities or their ancestors had developed sophisticated technologies over thousands of years, some preferred to imagine unknown outsiders crossing oceans without convincing evidence. The archaeological record would eventually overturn these assumptions. Careful excavations uncovered thousands of stone hammers abandoned at mining sites, wooden tools preserved beneath layers of sediment, charcoal suitable for radiocarbon dating, and unmistakable evidence that prehistoric miners had worked native copper using techniques entirely consistent with indigenous technologies of the Archaic period. No foreign inscriptions appeared. No Mediterranean artifacts emerged from the excavations. No evidence supported the existence of a vanished Old World mining colony. Instead, every major discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The ancient copper industry belonged to the long history of indigenous North America. As scientific methods improved throughout the 20th century, sensational theories steadily lost credibility, replaced by a growing appreciation for the achievements of the continent's earliest metalworkers. Even after archaeologists demonstrated the indigenous origins of the mines, another misunderstanding persisted. Because the Ojibwe occupied the Lake Superior region during the era of European contact, some writers assumed they must also have been the builders of every prehistoric excavation. Modern scholarship draws a more careful distinction. The most intensive mining activity associated with the old copper complex had taken place thousands of years before the Ojibwe became established around Lake Superior. This does not diminish the importance of Ojibwe history. On the contrary, it highlights the remarkable continuity of indigenous occupation in the Great Lakes. The Ojibwe inherited a landscape already marked by deep human history, developed their own enduring relationship with the copper-bearing country, and preserved extensive environmental knowledge of the region through generations of lived experience. Archaeology and oral tradition complement one another when each is understood within its proper historical context. European observers also tended to measure societies according to familiar standards of cities, kingdoms, and written documents. Because many indigenous communities organized themselves differently, outsiders often underestimated the complexity of their political relationships and economic networks. The ancient movement of copper across North America was therefore difficult for early historians to imagine. Without roads, wagons, or centralized empires resembling those of Europe, they questioned whether long-distance exchange on such a scale was even possible. Modern archaeology has demonstrated that these doubts were misplaced. Rivers, lakes, and established travel routes connected communities across immense distances. While social relationships, diplomacy, marriage alliances, seasonal gatherings, and reciprocal exchange sustained networks that endured for centuries. The absence of European-style institutions did not imply the absence of organization or sophistication. Today, historians increasingly examine early European accounts with both appreciation and caution. These journals remain invaluable because they provide some of the earliest written descriptions of the Great Lakes and preserve observations that might otherwise have been lost. At the same time, they reflect the perspectives, assumptions, and limitations of the people who wrote them. Explorers often misunderstood indigenous languages, interpreted unfamiliar customs through European beliefs, and lacked any concept of the immense timescales revealed by modern archaeology. Reading these documents alongside archaeological evidence and indigenous knowledge allows researchers to separate careful observation from cultural misunderstanding, producing a far more balanced reconstruction of the past. The story of Lake Superior's ancient copper country therefore teaches an important lesson about history itself. New discoveries do not always come from uncovering unknown artifacts. Sometimes they emerge from asking different questions about evidence that has existed all along. The mining pits never moved. The stone hammers remained where ancient workers left them. Indigenous communities continued living within the copper country for generations. What changed was the willingness of scholars to recognize that these pieces belonged to the same long and continuous history. Yet even as archaeology has answered many questions about who mined the copper and how they extracted it, another mystery remains unresolved. Why did such a productive mining tradition, capable of supplying metal across much of North America? The answer lies not in a single dramatic event, but in the slow transformation of societies whose histories continue to be pieced together one discovery at a time. By the time sustained European contact reached the Great Lakes in the 17th century, the continent's ancient copper economy had already changed dramatically from what it had been thousands of years earlier. The immense mining operations that once scarred the ridges of the Keweenaw Peninsula and the interior of Isle Royale were no longer active on the same scale. Yet the copper itself had not disappeared. Native copper could still be found along the shores of Lake Superior, and indigenous communities, including the Ojibwe, continued to know the landscape where it occurred naturally. The question that has puzzled archaeologists for generations is not why copper existed, but why an industry capable of supplying metal across vast regions of North America gradually faded away. Unlike the collapse of a kingdom or the destruction of a city, there is no single event that marks the end of the ancient copper tradition. Instead, the evidence points toward a slow transformation, shaped by changing technologies, shifting social priorities, and evolving networks of exchange. One of the earliest explanations proposed by archaeologists was that demand for copper simply declined over time. During the Archaic period, native copper offered clear advantages because it could be hammered into durable tools without the need for smelting. But stone technology never stood still. Craftspeople continued refining the production of chipped stone tools, producing blades and projectile points from high-quality chert, flint, and obsidian that were often sharper than their copper equivalents. In many situations, carefully worked stone remained the more practical material for cutting, hunting, and daily tasks. Copper retained important uses, but it no longer occupied the unique position it may once have held. Rather than replacing stone, the two materials had always existed side by side, and changing preferences may have gradually reduced the incentive for large-scale mining. Another possibility involves the evolution of social and ceremonial traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that the meaning of certain materials changed over thousands of years. During later prehistoric periods, communities across eastern North America increasingly emphasized other prestigious goods, including marine shell, finely crafted pottery, exotic stone, mica, and eventually objects associated with emerging ceremonial traditions, such as those seen within the Hopewell interaction sphere. Copper continued to appear in important ceremonial contexts, but it became one element within a much broader exchange of symbolic materials. As cultural values shifted, the enormous effort required to extract large quantities of native copper may no longer have offered the same social benefits it once had. Environmental factors may also have played a role, although the evidence remains incomplete. Mining native copper demanded considerable physical labor, as well as access to forests for wooden tools, fuel, shelters, and transportation equipment. Over centuries, repeated mining could have exhausted the most easily accessible surface deposits, forcing miners to pursue deeper or more difficult veins. This would not mean that copper had become scarce, since the region still contains enormous deposits today, but rather that obtaining it required greater effort than in earlier generations. Communities balancing hunting, fishing, gathering, and seasonal travel may have concluded that the costs of intensive mining no longer justified the rewards, especially if exchange networks were themselves changing. Population movements and shifting regional relationships likely contributed as well. Ancient North America was never static. Communities expanded, merged, relocated, and adapted to changing climates and local conditions over thousands of years. Rivers that once served as major exchange routes may have become less important as new connections emerged elsewhere. Alliances evolved, cultural traditions spread, and different regions developed their own centers of influence. In such a dynamic world, trade networks naturally expanded and contracted over time. Archaeologists increasingly view the decline of intensive copper mining not as an isolated event, but as one part of a much larger pattern of social transformation occurring across the continent. Importantly, researchers do not believe that ancient knowledge of copper suddenly vanished. The landscape itself ensured that knowledge continued. Native copper still appeared along shorelines and exposed rock faces, and later indigenous communities remained fully aware of its presence. The Ojibwe, who became established around Lake Superior centuries after the principal era of old copper mining, inherited this remarkable environment and incorporated its resources into their own relationship with the land. Historical accounts indicate that copper continued to be collected and used on a smaller scale, particularly for ornaments, tools, and ceremonial purposes. What changed was not awareness of the metal, but the organization and intensity of its extraction. Modern archaeology encourages caution when discussing this transition, because the surviving evidence does not support a single definitive explanation. There is no layer of destruction indicating warfare ended the mining industry. There is no evidence of a sudden environmental catastrophe that forced communities to abandon the copper country, nor is there proof that one population replaced another through dramatic conquest. Instead, the archaeological record reflects gradual change spread across many centuries, making it difficult to isolate one decisive cause. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the evidence, but a reminder that history is often more complex than simple narratives of rise and collapse. Perhaps the most important lesson is that the end of large-scale prehistoric mining did not mark the end of the copper country's significance. The ancient pits remained visible across the landscape, silent reminders of generations of labor that had reshaped the hills long before written history reached the Great Lakes. Later, indigenous communities continued to travel these forests, fish these waters, and pass knowledge of the land from one generation to the next. When Europeans finally arrived, they encountered not a forgotten wilderness, but a homeland whose history stretched far deeper than they imagined. Understanding why the ancient copper industry changed, therefore, requires looking beyond the mines themselves. It requires recognizing that landscapes endure even as societies evolve, and that the greatest legacy of Lake Superior's copper country may not be the metal extracted from its rocks, but the enduring network of human knowledge, adaptation, and connection that it helped create over thousands of years. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the story of North America's ancient copper industry was built largely on observation and speculation. Researchers could see the abandoned mining pits, collect stone hammers scattered across the forest floor, and recover beautifully crafted copper tools from archaeological sites. What they could not easily determine was how these discoveries fit together across thousands of years. That began to change as archaeology embraced increasingly sophisticated scientific methods. Instead of asking only who might have mined the copper, researchers started asking when the mines were used, how the metal was extracted, where it traveled, and what evidence could be tested rather than assumed. The result has been one of the clearest examples of how modern science can illuminate a prehistoric landscape without diminishing the knowledge preserved by indigenous communities who have long known the region. One of the most important breakthroughs came through radiocarbon dating. Although copper itself cannot be dated directly using this method, archaeologists discovered charcoal, wooden supports, wooden tools, and other organic materials preserved within or near ancient mining features. By measuring the decay of radioactive carbon in these remains, researchers established that many of the mining sites were worked during the Archaic period, beginning roughly 6,000 years ago. Some mines appear to have been used repeatedly over long periods, while others were abandoned after relatively limited activity. These dates demonstrated that the copper industry developed gradually over many generations, rather than appearing suddenly as the product of a single culture or historical event. Equally revealing were the thousands of stone hammers recovered from ancient mining areas. At first glance, these rounded rocks might appear ordinary, but close examination tells a different story. Many display battered surfaces, impact fractures, and patterns of wear consistent with repeated use against hard bedrock. Some still lie beside exposed copper veins, exactly where ancient miners left them. Their distribution across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale illustrates the remarkable scale of prehistoric mining. Rather than isolated excavations, archaeologists identified entire landscapes shaped by systematic extraction. Every abandoned hammer represents hours of labor performed by individuals whose names have disappeared from history, but whose work remains preserved beneath the forests of the Great Lakes. Another major advance has come through geochemical analysis. Native copper from different geological regions contains distinctive combinations of trace elements that can sometimes be compared with archaeological artifacts. By analyzing these chemical signatures, scientists have been able to identify probable sources for at least some copper objects discovered far from Lake Superior. Although the technique has limitations and not every artifact can be matched conclusively to a specific deposit, many studies support the conclusion that Great Lakes copper traveled widely across eastern North America. This scientific evidence reinforces what archaeologists had long suspected from the distribution of artifacts alone. Extensive exchange networks linked distant communities thousands of years before European arrival. Excavation methods have also transformed our understanding of how ancient miners actually worked the deposits. Early investigators often focused on recovering spectacular artifacts, but modern archaeology pays equal attention to the smallest details of a site. Soil layers reveal the sequence of mining activity. Broken hammerstones indicate where tools were manufactured or repaired. Fragments of wood preserved beneath collapsed rock help reconstruct mining techniques. Even microscopic traces of pollen and plant remains provide clues about the surrounding environment at the time the mines were active. Together, these pieces of evidence allow archaeologists to reconstruct ancient working landscapes with far greater confidence than was possible only a century ago. Despite these advances, responsible archaeology is equally defined by what it does not claim. Many questions remain unanswered because the available evidence simply does not allow firm conclusions. Researchers still debate exactly how labor was organized. Were mining expeditions carried out by small family groups, larger seasonal gatherings, or networks of cooperating communities? How much copper was extracted over the course of several millennia? How many people participated directly in mining compared with those involved in transporting and reshaping the metal? The archaeological record offers valuable clues, but not definitive answers. Recognizing these limits is one of the strengths of modern scholarship, distinguishing evidence-based interpretation from speculation. The relationship between archaeologists and indigenous nations has also evolved significantly in recent decades. Earlier generations of researchers often treated archaeological sites as isolated scientific resources, with little attention to the living communities connected to those landscapes. Today, many projects involve consultation and collaboration with tribal nations, whose ancestral ties to the region remain strong. This approach acknowledges that archaeology studies places that continue to hold cultural, historical, and spiritual significance. While scientific analysis can establish dates, identify artifacts, and reconstruct ancient technologies, indigenous knowledge contributes valuable perspectives on landscapes, place names, ecological relationships, and cultural continuity. Rather than competing forms of knowledge, they increasingly complement one another when approached with mutual respect. As new technologies continue to emerge, the story of Lake Superior's ancient copper industry becomes both clearer and more complex. High-resolution mapping has revealed previously unnoticed mining features hidden beneath forest vegetation. Portable analytical instruments allow researchers to study artifacts without damaging them. Improved dating techniques refine chronological sequences that once seemed uncertain. Yet every discovery also raises new questions. The more archaeologists learn about the sophistication of ancient mining and the immense distances over which copper traveled, the more remarkable these early societies appear. They remind us that technological innovation, long-distance exchange, and environmental expertise flourished in North America thousands of years before Europeans documented the continent. Perhaps the greatest lesson of modern archaeology is one of humility. Every stone hammer, every abandoned mining pit, and every copper artifact challenges assumptions that prehistoric societies were simple or isolated. Instead, they reveal generations of people capable of understanding complex landscapes, developing specialized technologies, and maintaining relationships across enormous distances. The evidence no longer supports the old myths of forgotten foreign civilizations or mysterious vanished miners. It points instead toward the creativity and resilience of indigenous North America. Even so, one final question remains. If archaeology has revealed how remarkable this ancient copper world truly was, why did its story fade from popular memory for so long? The answer lies not beneath the ground, but within the way history itself has been written, remembered, and sometimes overlooked. The story of Lake Superior's ancient copper trade remained hidden for so long not because the evidence disappeared, but because history was often told from a narrow perspective. For generations, the history of North America was presented as though meaningful commerce, technological innovation, and continent-wide connections began only after Europeans arrived. Indigenous societies were frequently described as isolated groups living independently across vast wilderness, with little attention given to the sophisticated relationships that had linked communities for thousands of years. As archaeological discoveries accumulated throughout the 20th century, that picture became increasingly difficult to defend. Every newly excavated mining pit, every stone hammer recovered from the forests of Michigan, and every copper artifact identified hundreds of miles from its geological source, revealed a continent that had long been interconnected. The evidence suggested that the real mystery was never whether such networks existed, but why they had been overlooked for so long. One reason lies in the nature of the archaeological record itself. Ancient copper miners left behind no written documents explaining their activities. They produced no surviving maps of trade routes, no inventories of exchanged goods, and no chronicles describing seasonal expeditions into the copper country. Much of what archaeologists know today has been reconstructed from physical evidence scattered across thousands of sites. A mining pit may reveal where copper was extracted, while a distant burial or settlement may preserve an artifact fashioned from that same metal. Connecting these discoveries requires decades of excavation, careful laboratory analysis, and comparisons between sites separated by enormous distances. Unlike civilizations whose histories survive in written records, the ancient peoples of the Great Lakes must be understood through fragments, patiently assembled over generations of research. Another reason involves the changing priorities of archaeology itself. During the 19th century, scholars often focused on spectacular ruins, monumental architecture, and civilizations that resembled familiar examples from Europe or the Mediterranean. North America's ancient hunter-gatherer societies received far less attention because they left different kinds of evidence. Yet the absence of pyramids or stone cities did not mean the absence of complexity. The copper mines of Lake Superior demonstrate that technological innovation can take many forms. Organizing labor, developing specialized mining techniques, mastering the properties of native copper, and maintaining exchange relationships across thousands of miles required knowledge, planning, and cooperation. Every bit as remarkable as more familiar achievements elsewhere in the ancient world. The growing recognition of indigenous knowledge has also reshaped historical interpretation. Earlier researchers sometimes viewed oral traditions as unreliable simply because they differed from written historical sources. Today, many historians and archaeologists take a more balanced approach. Oral traditions are understood as preserving cultural memory, relationships with landscapes, and knowledge accumulated through lived experience, rather than functioning as chronological historical documents in the modern sense. In the case of the Ojibwe, their deep familiarity with the Lake Superior region provides valuable context for understanding a landscape whose importance extends far beyond the archaeological record. While oral tradition does not identify the builders of every prehistoric mine, it reminds researchers that the copper country remained a meaningful homeland long after the era of intensive ancient mining had ended. This broader perspective has encouraged scholars to reconsider how they describe the ancient copper trade itself. Earlier interpretations sometimes imagined a highly organized commercial system resembling modern economies, while others dismissed the movement of copper as occasional or accidental. The evidence supports neither extreme. Instead, archaeologists increasingly describe a flexible network of interconnected communities that exchanged materials, ideas, and social relationships over long periods. Copper was one of many valuable resources circulating through these networks, alongside shell, chert, obsidian, mica, pigments, and other regionally important goods. The system did not require centralized governments or permanent marketplaces to function. It relied on generations of trust, reciprocity, seasonal gatherings, and established travel routes that connected people across an immense continent. Even with these advances, important questions remain unanswered. Researchers continue to debate the precise scale of copper production during different periods, the organization of mining expeditions, and the social meaning attached to copper in various communities. New analytical techniques have improved the ability to trace the geological origins of artifacts. But not every object can be linked conclusively to a specific source. Likewise, the reasons for the gradual decline of intensive mining continue to be explored through new excavations and environmental studies. Rather than signaling weakness, these ongoing debates reflect the healthy nature of scientific inquiry. Archaeology advances by refining interpretations as new evidence emerges, not by claiming certainty where certainty does not exist. Perhaps the most significant change has occurred not in the artifacts themselves, but in the questions historians choose to ask. Instead of searching for mythical lost civilizations or external influences, modern scholarship increasingly seeks to understand indigenous societies on their own terms. This shift recognizes that the achievements of North America's first copper workers require no outside explanation. Their knowledge developed through generations of observation, experimentation, and adaptation to one of the continent's most remarkable geological landscapes. Likewise, the Ojibwe and other indigenous nations who later lived around Lake Superior are no longer viewed merely as witnesses to an ancient past. They are recognized as part of a continuous human history that connects prehistoric mining landscapes with living cultural traditions still rooted in the region today. Looking back across 6,000 years, the ancient copper trade no longer appears as an isolated archaeological curiosity. It becomes part of a much larger story about human ingenuity, environmental knowledge, and the ability of communities to build relationships across extraordinary distances without written languages, wheeled vehicles, or centralized states. The forest surrounding Lake Superior may seem quiet today, but beneath their soil remain thousands of reminders that this landscape once stood at the center of one of North America's oldest and most influential exchange systems. The copper itself may have stopped moving in the quantities it once did, yet its legacy continues to reshape how historians understand the continent before European arrival. And in that realization lies the true significance of the Ojibwe's knowledge, not as proof of forgotten myths, but as a reminder that the deepest histories are often preserved through the enduring relationship between people and the land they call home. As the ancient copper mines gradually disappeared beneath forests and layers of soil, their story did not vanish overnight. Instead, it slowly faded from public awareness through a combination of changing priorities, limited written records, and the ways history itself came to be recorded. By the time European settlers began establishing permanent communities around Lake Superior, the great mining tradition belonged to a past so distant that even its original builders could no longer be identified by name. The abandoned pits became simply another feature of the landscape. Trees grew where miners had once worked. Moss covered the stone hammers they left behind. Fallen leaves filled excavated trenches until they blended almost seamlessly into the surrounding forest. Nature, patient and relentless, became the first guardian of one of North America's oldest industrial landscapes. The absence of written documents played a major role in this gradual disappearance from historical memory. European civilizations often preserved their past through chronicles, official records, and inscriptions carved into stone. The ancient peoples who mined Lake Superior's native copper passed knowledge through lived experience and oral traditions rather than writing. This did not make their history less real, but it meant that later generations of historians had fewer conventional sources to consult. When 19th century scholars searched for records explaining the mysterious mining pits, they found silence in the archives because they were looking in places where those stories had never been preserved. The evidence had always existed, but it rested beneath the ground and within landscapes rather than inside libraries. The rapid transformation of North America after European contact also shifted attention away from the distant prehistoric past. The fur trade reshaped the Great Lakes economy during the 17th and 18th centuries. French, British, and later American interests focused increasingly on commerce, military alliances, territorial expansion, and eventually industrial mining. New settlements, roads, ports, and railways changed the region both physically and culturally. When large-scale commercial copper mining began during the 19th century, public fascination centered on modern technology and economic opportunity rather than on the prehistoric miners who had worked the same deposits thousands of years earlier. Ancient pits were sometimes disturbed, filled, or overlooked as industrial operations transformed the landscape once again. At the same time, many early historians interpreted North American history through assumptions inherited from Europe. They expected civilizations to leave behind cities, monumental architecture, kings, and written records. Because the ancient copper miners fit none of these familiar categories, their achievements were often underestimated. The remarkable engineering required to extract native copper with stone hammers was overshadowed by comparisons to the monumental civilizations of Egypt, Greece, or Rome. Even when archaeological evidence clearly demonstrated the sophistication of prehistoric mining, it took decades for those discoveries to reshape popular understanding. The problem was never a lack of evidence, but a reluctance to recognize forms of complexity that differed from European historical experience. Indigenous communities experienced an even greater challenge in preserving historical memory during the colonial era. Disease, warfare, displacement, treaty negotiations, forced removals in some regions, and profound economic changes disrupted countless aspects of native life across North America. Yet, despite these hardships, the Ojibwe maintained enduring relationships with the Lake Superior homeland. Their language, place names, seasonal travel routes, ecological knowledge, and oral traditions continued connecting generations to the landscape. While archaeology reconstructs the deep chronology of prehistoric copper mining, the continued presence of the Ojibwe reminds us that the history of the Great Lakes did not end with the close of the old copper tradition. Human relationships with this land continued uninterrupted, adapting to new circumstances while preserving deep knowledge of the region's rivers, forests, and shores. Modern archaeology has gradually restored the ancient copper trade to its rightful place within North American history. Careful excavations, improved dating techniques, geochemical analysis, and collaboration with indigenous communities have transformed scattered discoveries into a coherent picture of a continent connected by extensive exchange networks long before European arrival. Museums now display copper tools once dismissed as isolated curiosities. Archaeological parks protect surviving mining features. Universities continue investigating questions that earlier generations could scarcely imagine asking. Every new discovery adds another piece to a story that remained hidden in plain sight for centuries. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this history is that forgetting is rarely a single event. Stories disappear through gradual neglect, shifting cultural priorities, incomplete records, and changing perspectives. They are not necessarily erased deliberately, nor are they always preserved completely. The ancient copper trade occupies this complex middle ground. It was never entirely lost because the mines remained, the artifacts survived, and indigenous communities continued living within the copper country. Yet it was never fully understood until archaeology, geology, history, and indigenous knowledge began informing one another. Only then did the scattered fragments reveal the extraordinary scale of what had once existed. Today, visitors walking through the forests of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula or looking across the waters of Lake Superior may see only quiet landscapes shaped by wind, rock, and trees. But beneath those forests lies evidence of generations of miners whose labor connected distant peoples across an entire continent. Their achievements challenge old assumptions about what prehistoric societies were capable of accomplishing. They remind us that innovation does not always announce itself through monumental cities or written empires. Sometimes it survives as a weathered stone hammer, an abandoned mining pit, or a piece of native copper carried hundreds of miles from the place where it first emerged from the earth. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that history is richest when it draws upon every reliable source available. Scientific evidence, careful scholarship, and the enduring knowledge of the indigenous communities whose relationship with this remarkable landscape continues to this day. For thousands of years, the shores of Lake Superior have quietly preserved one of the oldest stories of innovation in North America. The forests that now blanket the Keweenaw Peninsula and the rocky ridges of Isle Royale conceal thousands of ancient mining pits, each representing countless hours of labor carried out with nothing more than stone hammers, wooden tool, and remarkable knowledge of the land. Long before written history reached the Great Lakes, generations of indigenous peoples recognized the extraordinary properties of native copper, learned how to extract it, shape it, and exchange it across a continent connected not by roads or empires, but by rivers, lakes, trust, and enduring human relationships. The Ojibwe entered this story centuries after the earliest phases of intensive copper mining had ended. Yet their importance lies in something no less remarkable. They became the inheritors of the copper country itself. Their ancestors built lives around Gichigami, the Great Sea, developing an intimate understanding of its forests, shorelines, islands, and waterways. Through lived experience and oral tradition, they preserved knowledge of a landscape that had already witnessed thousands of years of human history. Modern archaeology does not suggest that the Ojibwe created the ancient mining pits, nor do Ojibwe traditions claim such a role. Instead, the archaeological record and indigenous knowledge complement one another, revealing different chapters of a much longer human story. One explains when the mines were dug and how copper was worked. The other reminds us that these places never became empty ruins. They remained part of a living homeland, whose significance continued across generations. Perhaps the greatest transformation has occurred not in the evidence itself, but in the questions historians have learned to ask. Earlier generations often searched for lost civilizations, foreign explorers, or mysterious outsiders to explain the ancient mines. Today, the overwhelming weight of archaeological research points toward a different conclusion. The people responsible were the indigenous inhabitants of North America, whose technological ingenuity developed through thousands of years of careful observation and adaptation. Their achievements require no mythical visitors and no forgotten empire. The evidence speaks clearly enough on its own. Massive stone hammers, carefully shaped copper tools, radiocarbon-dated mining sites, and artifacts found across distant regions all testify to a continent whose societies were far more interconnected than older histories once imagined. This realization also reshapes our understanding of trade itself. Modern commerce often depends upon governments, corporations, and written contracts. The ancient exchange networks of North America relied instead upon relationships built over generations. Rivers became highways, seasonal gatherings became marketplaces, and trust became the foundation upon which materials, ideas, and traditions moved across extraordinary distances. Copper from Lake Superior was never simply a commodity. It became part of a network that linked communities separated by forests, prairies, and mountain ranges, demonstrating that long-distance cooperation flourished in North America thousands of years before European arrival. The story also reminds us that archaeology is not a search for treasure, but a conversation with the past. Every excavation uncovers only fragments. Every scientific analysis answers one question while raising several more. Researchers continue refining dates, tracing the origins of copper artifacts, and studying how ancient communities organized labor and exchange. At the same time, collaboration with indigenous nations has enriched archaeological interpretation by recognizing that landscapes possess histories extending beyond what can be excavated. Scientific evidence and indigenous knowledge each illuminate different aspects of the same world, and together they provide a fuller understanding than either could achieve alone. In many ways, the Copper Country stands as a symbol of continuity rather than disappearance. Civilizations changed, trade routes evolved, new peoples settled the region, European empires arrived. Industrial mines reshaped the landscape once again. Yet Lake Superior remained what it had always been, a place where geology, ecology, and human experience intersected in extraordinary ways. The cliffs still hold veins of native copper. The rivers still flow toward the Great Lake. The forests continue growing above ancient mine shafts dug thousands of years ago. Time altered the people and their societies, but the land retained the memory of every generation that called it home. Today, as archaeologists continue uncovering new evidence and indigenous communities continue preserving their cultural traditions, the story of Lake Superior's copper trade is no longer viewed as an isolated curiosity. It has become an essential chapter in the broader history of North America, a reminder that innovation, environmental knowledge, and continent-wide exchange did not begin with European exploration. They were already deeply rooted in this land long before the first colonial maps were drawn. The ancient miners may never have imagined that their work would still be visible 6,000 years later, or that people from around the world would one day study the stone hammers they left behind. Yet their legacy survives not because they built monuments that reached toward the sky, but because they understood the land beneath their feet. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. The history of North America was never waiting to be discovered. It was always here, preserved in its landscapes, remembered through indigenous knowledge, and patiently revealed through the careful work of archaeology. The story of the ancient copper trade is ultimately not about a metal, but about people. It is about generations who learned to read a landscape with extraordinary precision, who transformed natural resources into tools, symbols, and connections, and who built relationships that stretched across an entire continent without written maps or centralized empires. It is also about the importance of listening to every reliable source of history, archaeological evidence, scientific research, and the enduring knowledge of indigenous communities whose connection to these places has never truly been broken. Together, they reveal a North America that was dynamic, innovative, and deeply interconnected long before Europeans arrived. Some histories survive in books, others beneath layers of earth, and others in the memories carried from one generation to the next. The ancient copper country of Lake Superior reminds us that the past is not silent. It is still speaking, if we are willing to listen with patience, humility, and respect.